You ever meet someone whose name just felt American, strong, familiar, maybe even comforting, but you realize you haven't heard it in decades? Names that once filled classrooms, baseball fields, and Sunday church pews have quietly vanished. You used to know a Norma on your street, a Chester who fixed cars, a Doris who baked pies every weekend. Now those names sound like echoes from a world that doesn't exist anymore. America once named its children after hope, family, and tradition. Earl, Marvin, Phyllis, Gertrude. They weren't trendy, they were timeless. They carried the weight of the people who built this country, farmers, factory workers, soldiers, teachers. Each name told a story of grit, honesty, and love. But then, something shifted. The world sped up. New names arrived, sleek, modern, global. The old ones got boxed away like family photographs in an attic. You don't hear Edna on a playground anymore, or Howard at a graduation. Yet those names still breathe in our memories, stitched into the voices of people who raised us, who shaped us, who left pieces of themselves in the way we speak. Laugh and remember. Tonight, we're opening that box. Dusting off 20 American names that once meant something. Names that shaped small towns, Sunday dinners, and the soundtrack of growing up. These are more than forgotten names. They're the sound of a country that knew who it was. There was a time when names told you everything about a person before they even spoke. You could hear a name and picture the life behind it. The calloused hands, the strong handshake, the Sunday hat, the front porch stories. Names weren't chosen to sound good. They were chosen to mean something. In small towns across America, names carried the weight of legacy. A boy named Earl was expected to work hard. A girl named Betty was born to keep the family together. A Charles would take care of business. A Doris would remember birthdays, recipes, and every neighbor's name. Those weren't just names. They were roles. They built communities. Back then, parents didn't name their children to stand out. They named them to belong. Think of the 1930s and 40s, hard years. The kind that taught people to value roots. Families named their children after grandparents, uncles, heroes, presidents. Frank, Edith, Harold, Mildred. You can almost hear the cadence of those names, solid, grounded, American. They rolled off the tongue like a handshake you could trust. In the 1950s, names like Chester and Marjorie were everywhere. You saw them on diner uniforms, baseball rosters, school attendance lists. They felt ordinary, but ordinary was the goal. Ordinary meant dependable. It meant you showed up on time, worked with your hands, believed in decency. Norma was the name of a mother who never sat down until everyone else had eaten. Eugene was the man who fixed your fence without being asked. Well, Phyllis was the church pianist who remembered every hymn by heart. Those names built neighborhoods. The truth is, names back then didn't chase style. They carried substance. They came from the Bible, from ancestors, from history. Parents chose names they hoped would make their children strong, not popular. Samuel from Scripture, Clara for light, Walter for ruler. Every name meant something real. Even nicknames had stories. Bud, Red, Slim. They came from the way you looked, the way you worked, the way people loved you. You didn't pick your nickname. You earned it. That's what names did. They told stories before you had to. In those days, you didn't need to ask where someone came from. You could tell by their name. An Earl belonged to the Midwest. A Gladys might come from the South. A Howard sounded like New England. Steady, polite, dependable. A Betty Lou or Mary Ellen could only be from the heartland. And when you said those names, they felt like home. There's a reason those names stuck for decades. They represented an America that valued continuity. You named your daughter after your mother. You named your son after your father. It was a quiet way of saying, and we don't forget where we come from. Generations shared names like they shared land, passed down, cared for, and carried forward. That's why names like Gertrude or Horace still show up on headstones in every small town cemetery. They're not gone. They're waiting. Each one is a marker of a life that built the country you live in now. When you read those names, you can almost hear the rhythm of old America. Porch swings, dinner bells, radio hums through summer windows. A name like Martha feels like a kitchen filled with the smell of cornbread. A name like Earl feels like a pickup truck and a promise. Agnes feels like a letter written in careful cursive on yellow paper. They carried character inside their sound. Even in the city, those names meant something. Stanley ran the corner store. Helen was the nurse who never forgot a face. Raymond delivered your milk before sunrise. You didn't just know their names, you trusted them. That's what's changed. Today's names are fast, flashy, global. They sound like they were made for a screen, not a community. They move quickly, but they don't root anywhere. Back then, names were soil. Every Eleanor and Harold came from someone who believed in staying put long enough to matter. When they spoke their names, it was like speaking family history out loud. Names like Bernice or Vernon might sound old-fashioned now, but once they were the sound of progress. They belonged to people who worked in factories, built schools, plowed fields, fought wars. and came home to build more. You can trace America's growth through its names. In the 1910s, names were heavy, biblical, ancestral, formal. By the 1920s and 30s, they softened a bit. Ruth, Evelyn, Lillian, Clyde. The 1940s brought the warriors, Betty, Robert, Dorothy, George, names that could fit on dog tags, telegrams, and postcards sent across oceans. By the 1950s, those names ruled every block. Shirley, Patricia, Gary, Barbara. Names you could see on lunchboxes, wedding invitations, and bowling league shirts. They weren't just popular, they were communal. When someone yelled Bob, 3 heads turned and everyone smiled. But with each new decade, America drifted from those roots. The 1970s brought new trends, names that sounded freer, lighter, less tied to the past. By the 1990s, Brandon and Ashley had replaced Harold and Dorothy, and now those old names sit in silence, waiting in old yearbooks, wedding photos, and handwritten letters that nobody throws away because they sound like home. But here's the thing. Those names aren't just history. They're memory. They remind us of a time when names were more than words. They were promises. When a man named Clarence shook your hand, it meant something. When a woman named Lois brought you soup, you knew it came with care. Those names had presence. They told the story of a generation that worked hard, loved deeply, and spoke plainly. That's what we've lost. Not just the sound of those names, but the world they built. Every Norma, Harvey, and Phyllis was part of a story that still runs through your veins. You might not use their names anymore, but you live in the world they made. And if you listen close, you can still hear those names in the wind, whispered through family stories, church halls, and the quiet hum of memory. Names like Ruth, Frank, and Clara aren't gone. They're waiting for someone to remember, because names don't die. They just wait for the right time to come home again. There's a quiet sadness in realizing you haven't met a Doris in 20 years, or a Glenn, or a Thelma. These names used to fill every room, every yearbook, every neighborhood. You couldn't walk down a grocery aisle without hearing one of them called out. Now they've slipped from our mouths, replaced by sounds that feel lighter, quicker, newer. But names don't vanish all at once. They fade like photographs, one generation at a time. It started somewhere in the late 1970s. America began to chase what was modern. You can hear it in the language, see it in the advertising, feel it in the culture. Everything that felt old-fashioned suddenly felt slow. The names that once meant strength began to sound outdated. Ethel became an old lady's name. Norman became a punchline. Geraldine disappeared from birth certificates overnight. The world was changing. New music, new clothes, new dreams. And with that change came new names. Parents stopped naming their kids after their parents. Tradition gave way to individuality. Everyone wanted something unique, a name nobody else had. Something fresh, something cool. And just like that, the names that had built entire towns began to vanish from hospital records, from report cards, from memory. You can trace it year by year. In 1960, there were thousands of little boys named Harold. By 1990, there were almost none. Gladys went from a top 100 name to extinction in less than 30 years. The same happened to Chester, Vernon, Clara, Mildred, and Edna. They didn't just fall out of style. They fell out of time, but it wasn't just fashion. It was identity. America had always been a country that reinvented itself. The frontier spirit never died. It just moved into culture. Each generation wanted to start new. And nothing says new like a name that's never been spoken. Before the 1980s, brought Crystal, Jason, Jennifer, Tiffany. The 1990s added Brandon, Jessica, Ashley, Ryan. The sound of America shifted. The old vowels disappeared. The names got smoother, shinier, faster, like everything else. Phyllis couldn't survive in a world of Britneys. A Herbert couldn't compete with Chase. The rhythm changed. The country changed. And yet in losing those names, we lost something deeper. The sound of belonging. Old names carried weight. They weren't chosen for fashion. They were chosen for family. Walter was your grandfather's name. Clara was your mother's name. Ruth was your aunt's name. They were part of your bloodline. When you said them, you said home. Modern names broke that chain. They were beautiful, yes. Creative, yes. But they didn't connect backward, only forward. They were seeds without roots. There's a reason the old names still pull at you when you hear them. They remind you of a time when people named their children after someone who'd already survived something. Those names were lived in. They came with stories attached. Eleanor wasn't just a name. It was a legacy. George wasn't just a name. It was a pillar. Doris wasn't just a name. It was a heartbeat. Now, when you hear one, it's usually spoken by an older voice, or carved in stone, or whispered in a story that starts with, "My grandmother used to say." That's how names die, not with silence, but with memory. They move from birth certificates to gravestones, from roll calls to recollections. But if you pay attention, you'll notice something else. The names didn't just disappear. They transformed. You'll still find traces of them in middle names, in initials, in the way parents try to honor the past without sounding old. A Geraldine becomes a Jerry. A Clara becomes a Claire. A Harold becomes a Harry. It's as if the names are whispering from the past, trying to stay alive in the margins of modern life. Every so often, you'll meet someone young with one of those names, and it'll stop you in your tracks. A baby named Ruth, a boy named Eugene. You'll smile without meaning to, because it feels like seeing a familiar face in a crowd. There's comfort in those names, stability, something the world doesn't give much anymore. It's easy to think of names as just sound, but sound carries emotion. Martha sounds warm because you've known a Martha who was kind. Henry sounds trustworthy because the name has earned it through generations of good men. When those names fade, the sound of that trust fades too. It's strange how much a name can say about an era. Say Agnes, and you're back in the 1940s. Say Patricia, and it's 1965. Say Beverly, and you can almost hear a rotary phone ringing in the background. That's what these names are, time machines. They carry the scent of old kitchens, the tone of old radios, the feeling of front porches at dusk, and when they vanish, so does that part of the soundtrack of America. Every Marvin and Ethel and Norma Jean carried not just a person, but a period of life. When small talk still mattered, when neighbors waved, when people wrote letters in longhand. Today, people name their children after celebrities, books, and shows. Back then, they named them after people they knew. There's a difference. A name used to be a bridge between generations. Now it's a brand, but maybe that's why nostalgia hits so hard. Because when you remember a name like Lois or Vernon, you're not just remembering a person. You're remembering a world, a slower one, a simpler one where a name meant roots, not reach. And even though those names have vanished from birth records, they haven't vanished from memory. They live in stories. They live in photo albums. They live in the way people still say, "My granddad Earl used to tell me." And when you hear it, you feel something shift inside you. A reminder that the world didn't always move this fast. That once it paused long enough to remember who it was. So maybe these names aren't gone. Maybe they're just resting, waiting for a world that slows down enough to deserve them again. Because the truth is, names never really die. They only wait to be spoken with love again. You don't forget a name that once mattered. Even after the person is gone, the name stays, like a song that hums in the back of your mind. You might not say it out loud anymore, but you hear it when something reminds you. A smell, a photograph, a certain tone in someone's voice. And suddenly, you're back there again. That's how these old American names live on, not through use, but through memory. Every Helen had a laugh that could fill a room. Every Frank had a story you could listen to for hours. Every Mildred knew how to make people feel seen. These weren't just names. They were entire histories packed into a few letters. Think about your own life. Somewhere in your memory there's a Betty. Maybe she lived down the street and always waved when you rode your bike by. There's a George who taught you something small but important. How to fix something, how to drive, how to stand up straight. There's a Lois who sent birthday cards in perfect cursive, never missing a year. Those names aren't gone. They're woven into the rhythm of who you are. You might not realize it, but your habits carry them. The way you fold towels, the way you hum while washing dishes, the way you remember to call your mother on Sundays. All of that came from people who carried those old names. People who believed in small kindnesses that added up to something big. That's what those names represented. Constancy. They didn't move fast or fade easy. They stayed. There's a reason names like Henry, Ruth, Eleanor, and Albert still sound familiar, even if they're rare. They were built to last. They came from families that didn't see life as disposable. You didn't change your name for attention. You lived your name for legacy. Names back then were like heirlooms, polished, preserved, passed down. A Clara could become a Claire, but the heart stayed the same. A William could turn into Bill, but he still carried the same quiet strength. And every family had that one name that never left the bloodline. The one that came up every generation, like a promise. Maybe it was Samuel. Maybe it was Margaret. Maybe it was Raymond. Each time it was used, it meant one thing, remember, because naming wasn't about fashion. It was about keeping the story going. Even now, when you hear one of those names, it stops time. You hear Edna, and suddenly you remember an old voice on the phone saying, "Eat something, dear." You hear Herbert, and you see a man in suspenders at a picnic table, smiling quietly while everyone else talks. You hear Agnes, and you picture an old photograph on the mantel, black and white, but still alive somehow. That's the power of names. They outlive the people who wore them. They hold the weight of every laugh, every heartbreak, every victory. They echo through generations like bells that never stop ringing. You can't say Dorothy without thinking of warmth. You can't say Clarence without hearing steady footsteps on a wooden floor. You can't say Virginia without smelling lilacs and Sunday dinners. The names carried identity, not just for the person, but for the time. There was a texture to them. They sounded like real things. Wood, stone, iron, light. That's what those names felt like. Tangible, honest. You could build a life on them. Now, when people name their children, they scroll lists and apps, searching for something different. Back then, difference didn't matter. Meaning did. That's why these names stick to memory like they do. They were spoken with purpose. They were written on envelopes, carved into trunks, sewn into quilts. They lived in the fabric of life itself, and when someone with one of those names passed, the name didn't fade. It settled in the house, in the photographs, in the way the family still talks. You can still hear them in phrases people say without thinking. That's what Grandma Helen used to say. Uncle Walter would have known what to do. Those sentences keep the names alive without even meaning to. Sometimes you'll find those names in old recipe cards, written in shaky cursive, or in yearbooks from the 1950s, faces smiling in black and white, or in love letters folded so many times the paper's soft. You'll run your finger over the name, and for a moment it feels like touching time itself, because names like those don't just remind you of people. They remind you of values. Work hard. Stay humble. Keep your word. Take care of your own. They're more than old-fashioned. They're foundational. That's what makes their absence feel so loud. The world has changed, yes. But in changing, it lost the comfort of names that carried meaning before they carried sound. There's beauty in hearing a name that has lived a long life. It makes you remember that not everything new is better. Sometimes it's just louder. And maybe that's why, in recent years, a few of those names have started to come back. Slowly, quietly. You'll see a baby named Hazel, a boy named Arthur, a little Eleanor running around a playground. You'll smile because you know what that means. The cycle is turning. People are remembering again. Remembering that roots matter. That connection matters. That a name isn't just a decoration. It's a declaration. And maybe that's how memory works. It doesn't die. It just waits until someone's ready to listen again. So even if you never meet another Gloria or Milton or Vera, their names still echo. They echo in the way people still live. Slower, kinder, truer, even if they don't realize where it came from. Because names aren't just sounds we use to call each other. They're the echoes of everything we've loved and lost. And as long as we remember, the old names never really leave. They just keep whispering from the corners of memory saying, "We were here." And we still are. Something strange is happening in America. After decades of chasing newness, new names, new trends, new everything, people are circling back. Slowly, quietly. It's not on magazine covers or baby blogs yet. It's in living rooms, family trees, and birth announcements that sound like echoes. You start to hear it again. Ruth, Arthur, Clara, Walter, old names in young mouths. Names that once disappeared, now breathing again. Maybe it's nostalgia. Maybe it's rebellion against the noise. But the truth is simpler. People are realizing that roots feel good. In a world where everything changes by the week, an old name feels steady. It reminds you that you come from somewhere, that your story didn't start with you. Parents today are naming their children after grandparents they never met. They're digging through family Bibles, photo albums, and letters, finding names that used to mean something. And when they speak them out loud, Eleanor, Harvey, Louise, they realize those names still carry weight. They sound like belonging. It's not about bringing the past back. It's about remembering what the past gave us. Connection. Because when you name a child Edith, you're not just reviving a word. You're reviving a way of thinking. You're saying that family matters. That legacy matters. That the people who came before you deserve to live again in the voices of those who come after. Every Hazel, every Theodore, every Margaret born today carries that quiet return, a small rebellion against forgetting. You can see it in the rise of vintage name lists. You can feel it in the way people are drawn to the sound of them. Those names don't shout, they hum. They're steady and honest. They sound like they belong to someone who knows who they are. And maybe that's what America's been missing. Names with backbone. Names that sound like they've worked a day in their life. Names that belong on lunch pails and love letters. Well, not just usernames. Because those names carry something money can't buy. Character. Say Florence and you picture kindness. Say Leonard and you hear laughter. Say Beatrice and you feel calm. Those names shape behavior because they carry a story. The return of those old names isn't just about fashion. It's about identity. It's about wanting to feel part of something real again. You can see it in small towns where people still call kids by their full names. Not nicknames, not abbreviations. Just the real thing. You can feel it when a teacher calls roll and you hear a Henry instead of a Jaden. You can see it when grandparents cry hearing their name come back after 50 years. That's the quiet magic of names. They can bring people back without bringing them back. When a child is named Evelyn, a grandmother's memory stirs. When a boy is called Calvin, a great-grandfather's story breathes again. The line continues. The legacy survives. Maybe we lost something when we stopped naming our children after people we knew. We broke the chain. And now, after all the noise, we're reaching back to mend it. Because deep down, We all want to belong to something that lasts longer than a trend. That's what these names offer. Endurance. You don't outgrow a name like Ruth. You grow into it. You learn to fill it with your own strength, your own grace. And maybe that's why, even in this restless world, the old names are finding their way back. They speak the language of endurance. They remind us that beauty doesn't need to be reinvented. It just needs to be remembered. It's poetic, really. The names that built this country, the names that faded into silence, are coming back to remind us who we are. They survived wars, recessions, migrations, and decades of neglect. And still, they returned. Because the truth is, you can't erase a name that's lived a good life. It stays in the soil. It stays in the stories. It stays in the way we talk about the people we love. There's something sacred about that. You can stand in an old cemetery, read a stone that says Lillian or George, and feel something real. Not sadness, connection. The quiet, knowing that you're walking in the shadow of names that once spoke laughter, courage, and love. And now, maybe, we're finally learning to speak them again. The old names aren't ghosts anymore. They're roots. They're coming back. Not as relics, but as reminders that no matter how fast the world moves, some things are worth holding on to. Because one day, long after we're gone, our names will sit in someone else's mouth. Someone who will say them softly, with warmth, with memory. And they'll smile. And that's how you know a name never really dies. It just waits for the right time to come home. Names are more than words. They're how we carry time. Every name tells a story of where we've been, what we've lost, and what we still hope to find. These forgotten American names aren't really gone. They're sleeping in the pages of history, waiting for the next generation to whisper them back to life. Maybe one of them belongs to you. Maybe it's the name of someone who built your story before you even knew it. And if you love remembering the pieces of America that time almost erased, you'll want to be here for the next one, when we uncover the lost neighborhoods, diners, and drive-ins that once made this country feel alive. If you'd like a little more memory in your inbox, join the newsletter, where we keep the past breathing, one story at a time. Because the names may fade from the world, but they never fade from the heart.